The day that woman moved in, my loneliness ended. But that same day, I woke up, looked in the mirror, and realized I had officially become a ghost in my own home. Do you understand that feeling? When you're still breathing but no longer exist? When even your smallest movement needs permission from someone else's presence? I shrank myself, little by little, like a clock being wound backward until it stops ticking. I gave up my habits, everything that once made me who I was. I learned to force smiles so artificial my facial muscles would stiffen just to make this space more comfortable for someone else. I lived like a beggar in my own kingdom. And the worst part, I knew it, and I kept going anyway. But then, the morning she left without a word, without a sound, I sat down in my worn-out armchair, brewed a pot of tea, and for the first time, after 3 years of tormenting myself, I felt like I could breathe. My name is Arthur. I'm 95 years old, and before I tell you what I lost, you need to know who I once was. My wife, Martha, passed away 15 years ago. People often assume that a man my age, losing his life partner, would fall apart, but I didn't. I didn't cry out loud or try to fill the void with noise. I returned to my work. I was a restorer of antique clocks. These small, intricate, proud machines, they never lie. When they're broken, they're broken. When they run, they run. And in that absolute honesty, I found healing. I had a ritual I never broke. I woke up at 5 a.m., no alarm needed. My body rose on its own, like a Swiss watch. I made tea, no sugar, no milk, just hot water and dry leaves. I sat in my workshop, where the only sound was the steady ticking of dozens of clocks in motion. No television, no voices, no disturbances. And you know, that silence wasn't emptiness. It was air. It was the only thing that allowed me to breathe. From 5 to 9 inches the morning, I didn't have to be anyone. I didn't have to please anyone. I simply existed. But then, the outside world started knocking. And they didn't knock gently. They pounded. My son Henry, my daughter Clara, they began looking at me with the one expression I hated most, pity. Clara once said to me, her voice soft as if she were comforting a child, "Dad, seeing you all alone among those clocks is just sad. You need someone to keep you company. Sad." Such a light word when spoken, but unbearably heavy in the mind of a 2-year-old man. They didn't yell at me. They didn't force me. They used something far more subtle, devotion, care. And do you know what's most dangerous? When everyone around you insists that you're lonely and pitiful, you start to doubt yourself. You begin to look at a life you once found complete and wonder if maybe you were wrong. At 92, I stumbled, not on the stairs but in my own mind. I gave in. I agreed to meet Helen, a widow Clara introduced me to. Helen wasn't a bad person. Not at all. She was warm. She liked to talk. She laughed often. She liked turning on the television in the mornings, loud programs filled with music and non-stop chatter. She brought liveliness, the very thing my children believed I lacked. But that liveliness was the first thing that suffocated me. And I was the one who opened the door and let it in. You might think suffocation comes from big things, arguments, harsh words. But no, at my age it comes from things so small people call them love. Helen liked to talk in the mornings. She would walk into my workshop before the light had fully settled on the metal gears. I'd be bent over, restoring an 1,890 pendulum clock, a machine that had outlived even my recent memories. And then she would ask, "Are you tired? What should we have for lunch?" Simple questions, kind, no ill intent, but each time it felt like an invisible hand slipping between the ticking beats, throwing them off until eventually everything shattered. I began to realize something no one had warned me about. Starting over is not an opportunity. At this age, it's an unsolvable equation. Two people who have lived over 90 years with entirely different habits cannot simply be fitted together like missing puzzle pieces. We are not young people learning to adapt. We are finished structures, and so every collision becomes brutal. She has her children, I have mine. She arranges the kitchen her way. I place each teacup in mine. Small things, but they are roots that run deep through a lifetime, and sometimes being peacefully alone is the easiest state a person can achieve. Young people carry a profound misunderstanding. You fear loneliness. You run from it as if it were a disease. But what Henry and Clara call loneliness, we who are old call freedom. The freedom to wake up without answering to anyone. The freedom to be silent without being seen as strange. The freedom to live at your own pace without syncing yourself to someone else's rhythm. I have my clocks. I have the books I reread. I have mornings where the light falls across my workbench like a sacred ritual. I don't need anyone to fill a void, because to me that void never existed. It's not that we've lost the ability to love. That's another misunderstanding. People in their 60s, 70s, 80s, or like me, 95, don't seek new love, not because we are numb, but because we've already lived through it all. I loved. I married Martha. We built a home together, argued, fell silent, forgave, sacrificed, and then I lost her. I know how beautiful love can be, but I also know how completely it can drain a person. At this age, I'm no longer driven by the need to have someone in order to feel whole. Young people love to be recognized, to feel they belong somewhere. But I've lived long enough to know who I am. I no longer need a relationship to prove my worth. And then there is a truth no one wants to hear, but everyone must face. When Martha died, the pain wasn't just a wound. It was a fracture running through my entire being. But that fracture taught me something cruel, that everything is impermanent. The deeper you attach, the more violently you are torn apart when it's gone. The more you love, the more you have to lose. And after all that loss, I chose a different way of loving, lighter, more distant, without attachment, without possession. What I long for now is not a new love, not long conversations or holding hands. What I crave almost painfully is a morning without interruption, a meal eaten in silence, a night's sleep where I don't have to brace myself for someone else's presence the next day. Peace, to me, is no longer a state, it is a luxury. And the bitterest part is that I traded it away with my own hands. I don't remember exactly when it began. Maybe one afternoon when sunlight slipped through the window, or one evening when the television grew so loud I could no longer hear my clocks. But I know one thing for certain. I couldn't go on. Not because Helen was wrong, but because I had drifted too far from who I was. I told her on a very ordinary morning. No drama, No climax. She stood in the kitchen, still holding her teacup. She asked me, gently, what she had done wrong. And I looked at her, a kind woman who didn't deserve any hurt, and I told her the truth. You didn't do anything wrong. The fault is mine. I tried to reshape the rest of my life to fit someone else's expectations. I said nothing more. At this age, you learn that long explanations only make things heavier. Henry was disappointed. I saw it in his eyes. Not anger, but helplessness. Clara cried. She called me a stubborn old man. She said I was selfish. Maybe she was right in her own way. But at 95, other people's judgments no longer define me. I've lived nearly a century. I've carried every role a person can have. I no longer need to take on another part just to please someone else. I would rather be selfish in their eyes than become a stranger in my own life. And then she left. No noise, no blame, just an emptiness, slowly returning to where it belonged. The next morning I woke up at 5. No footsteps in the hallway, no television murmuring from the living room, no questions waiting for me. I lay still for a few seconds, just listening, and then I realized the silence had come back. Not a frightening silence, but a familiar one, like an old friend I had long lost. I walked into my workshop. Everything was still there. The antique clocks still faithfully keeping their own time, as if nothing had ever changed. The ticking, steady, precise, unhurried. I brewed a pot of tea. I sat down in my old armchair. The cup rested in my hands, but I didn't drink. I just sat there, watching the gears move. And in that moment, I remembered something I had forgotten for 3 years. I was living, not merely existing, not adapting, not enduring, but living, fully, peacefully, uncut, unbent. The loneliness my children feared had taken on another form, one I had always understood, but allowed others to make me doubt. It wasn't loneliness. It was freedom. I know what you're thinking. You're afraid of dying alone. An empty room. An aging body. No one beside you. No one calling your name. I was afraid of that too. But time and loss taught me something no book ever could. Dying alone is a real fear. But living your final years as someone you no longer recognize is far worse. You can have people around you, but if you must stay silent when you want to speak, speak when you want silence, reshape your rhythm to match someone else's, then you are no longer yourself. And at that point, loneliness is no longer about whether someone is there or not. It's about having abandoned yourself. If you are in your 60s, 70s, or 80s, if the people around you keep telling you that you need someone, that living alone is pitiful, that your silence is a problem to be fixed, then stop and question it. Never choose companionship just to escape the dark. Because if you haven't learned how to sit quietly within your own silence, then no matter how many people surround you, you will still be alone. But if you truly belong to yourself, then everything you need is already there. The morning is yours. The silence is yours. The small rituals are yours. And that is enough for me at 95. The turning gears before my eyes, the ticking that never lies, and a pot of tea slowly cooling in my hands. That is not emptiness. That is a perfect kind of wholeness.